Hello, friends. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation about regulating the internet. My name is Chris McKenna, and we're just going to wait one more moment here for folks to join us. I know we have different time zones jumping in, and so we'll be back with you in just a second. Well, with that, let's get started. Hi, I'm Chris McKenna, the founder of Protect Young Eyes, and I am so glad that you are with us, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, for this second webinar in a series of critical conversations from the human change movement, regulating the internet from the Kids Online Safety Act here in the US to the UK Online Safety Act and other places that are moving in this direction. We're going to ask questions like, is government doing enough? What is the role of government when it comes to protecting our children? So our objectives today are twofold. Number one, we want to raise awareness of the global regulatory landscape geared at protecting children online, including new policy developments. And we also want to educate wherever you happen to be, whether you're a policymaker yourself, business owner, or a parent, and a combination of those things, so that you can understand better the challenges that we're all feeling and maybe some of the opportunities for us to make positive change. So for those who joined us in September, thanks for coming back. Back in September, we had a conversation about phone-free childhood, and I'm glad you're back with us. So today I'm joined by three esteemed guests that you're going to meet in just a moment. And after a brief introduction, we'll have a discussion that'll last about 30 to 35 minutes. Afterward, there'll be some time for some Q&A, and then we'll have some time to jump in further and ask and answer some of your questions. For those who may not be familiar with the human change movement, it was launched at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2024, this last January, and we hosted 12 powerful panel discussions where we had conversations similar to the one that we're having today. We brought together international experts and started this debate and discussion about issues and solutions about how social media and the digitalization of childhood is changing the way that our children are growing up and potentially impacting future societies. Just as the consequences of climate change require us to protect the environment, the consequences of human change require us to protect and prepare children for the digital world. Friends, the bottom line is this: digital connections cannot replace real human connection. And I'm thrilled to extend this discussion that we started in Davos earlier this year to the discussion that we're going to have today. I want to begin by introducing our expert panelists. First, I want to introduce Gaia Bernstein. He's a law professor and technology policy expert at Seton Hall. And from what I understand, has just finished class to join us here today. You have so much going on, Gaia. I can't wait to hear your perspective. You've authored Unwired, which critiques the tech industry's role in technology overuse and advocates for legal solutions to encourage product redesign, something I know you're very passionate about. You've developed a nationally acclaimed student parent outreach program addressing screen overuse and its implications for policy and online reputation. And Gaia also advises policymakers on regulating addictive technologies, including social media. Thank you for being with us today, Gaia. Next, we have Adam Engel. Adam is the global lead for digital policy at the Lego Group, something that even us as adults, I'm sure some of you have enjoyed the products there, where he helps Lego maintain high standards for safety, privacy, and security in the digital products that Lego is creating, and also advocates for policy that empowers children online. Previously, Adam had very important roles with the Information Commissioner's Office, Emerging Technology Unit, where his team assessed the data protection impact of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, immersive worlds, blockchain, et cetera. And has also advised and mitigated privacy risks. Prior to that, he worked with the Australian government, involved in encryption policy, content moderation, and responsible implementation of AI. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Adam. And then finally, we have Jessica Elefante, an interdisciplinary writer, artist, and tech critic known for her book, and you gotta love this title, Raising Hell, Living Well, which explores themes of technology, capitalism, influence, and motherhood. Her work has appeared in notable publications like The Guardian, Vogue, and she is founder of Folk Rebellion, where she critiques contemporary culture, Previously a brand strategist honored on Brand Innovators 40 Under 40, she now leverages her expertise in tech and media as the co-chair for MAMA, Mothers Against Media Addiction, an organization focused on raising awareness about the impacts of media consumption on children and families. So important. Mama advocates for healthier media habits and promotes resources to combat media addiction. Jessica, thank you so much for being here. So, friends, we have so much to talk about. 30 minutes will hardly do justice, but I'd like to begin the conversation because when it comes to policy, I think this is one of those things that maybe average individuals or parents and others go, well, that's too complicated for me, or I don't know even how to engage at that level. But I think that everybody on this call today has a role. And Gaia, I'd like to start with you. Now, we have attendees really from all over the world, as I just said, with varying levels of understanding as to what it means, this intersection between policy and technology. So could you just lay a wide foundation for us so that we have a kind of a level understanding, explain maybe why we're seeing so much activity right now? It seems to have come in a bit of a tidal wave all over the world here, maybe a little bit on KOSA. Just sort of lay that foundation for us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I think we've been hearing reports about the harm of excessive use for a while, but if I would pinpoint one thing, which I think was the main instigator, was the impact on kids' mental health, which is a global issue, combined with the connection to social media use. I think these two together really instigated the influx of legal activity we've been seeing, especially since 2023. And what we're seeing in the US is a combination of an explosion of laws in states, hundreds of laws, bills, trying to regulate social media, other online providers to protect kids from online harms, to protect kids from excessive use. And the most prominent bill that's been discussed now is the federal bill, the Kids Online Safety Act, known as KOSA, which has passed the Senate with a huge bipartisan support of 98-3. Those who are familiar with US politics know how rare this is. So KOSA applies not just to social media, it applies to all kinds of online platforms. And it has two, I guess, hallmarks. One is what is called the duty of care. Basically, it imposes a duty on online providers to make sure that their design do not cause mental health harm, addiction, and other harms to kids. So, for example, if an online provider knows that their notifications are causing kids to obsessively check their phones, they are supposed to do something about that. The other hallmark, KOSA looks at what's called compulsive use. It talks about repetitive use that makes kids keep going back to the platform again and again to a point that it affects their psychological well-being, and basically prohibiting these online providers from using designs that we know are related to compulsive use. For example, the infinite scroll, which, if you go on Facebook or Instagram, there's never an end to a page. And KOSA is broad. It's not just looking at designs we know today. It's not a closed list. We know that tech companies will come up with new ways to keep users online. So I'd say these are the two main things in KOSA. And at this point, it's passed the Senate and it needs to pass the House of Representatives to become law.
Thank you for that, Gaia. I know that we've made progress. You mentioned the 91-3. That has never happened with anything here in the United States. And I know there's many children outside of the US, right? But many of the laws that we see springing up sometimes will come as a motivator out of what we've done right here, but that's not always true. And Adam, I want to pivot to you because we've seen movement in other countries that is steps beyond what we're seeing here in the United States. So I'd like just from your perspective, maybe even to broaden a little bit further outside of that start that we have there in the US with KOSA, but what are you seeing in other countries? It could be Australia, the UK, both places I know you've spent a lot of time. What are we seeing there around confronting harms, creating these safer spaces? Is it enough? Are we moving in the right direction in these countries too?
Thanks, Chris. The long and the short of it is that around the rest of the world, the regulatory regime is much more mature than in the US. I mean, one of the principal acts kind of out the gate was the Digital Services Act in the EU. That does set in kind of mandatory reporting requirements. It does put obligations on service providers to reduce elements of harm. The UK Online Safety Act in the United Kingdom is again a very robust piece of legislation targeting peer-to-peer services. So really, focused on those platforms where kids are interacting freely with others and sharing material freely with others. And it is looking at their exposure to harmful practices, their exposure to harmful contact, to harmful conduct, to harmful content, the kind of the four C's of online harms. I think, though, what is taking up the most attention right now globally is what my countrymen in Australia are doing. And you would have seen fresh out the gate last week that the Prime Minister announced that they will introduce legislation this year, or at least in this Parliament. And keep in mind, an election is coming up probably early next year, that will ban social media for under 16s. Now, there will be exemptions, we understand, to that ban for educational services and maybe for a few other services. But it is a pretty robust statement to say we will ban social media for kids across the whole of Australia for those under 16. Now, how that survives in Parliament is anyone's guess. It will obviously go to elections as well. But I think what that does show is, in Australia, in the US, in even at the EU level and some EU member state levels, there is a significant push to set at least a floor for online safety. Now, whether it's enough, I think that remains to be seen. These are very new regulations. They have not been in effect for very long, and companies are still working out how to comply with them. Now, I suspect it will be probably the start of a longer process as we understand what works and what doesn't work with the regulation. I think what's important, though, to understand is that the policymakers are clearly responding to a sincere alarm among parents and children that they are not safe online. So it's that until that momentum and that alarm kind of goes away, I wouldn't expect policymakers to stop.
Yeah, and as you said, it is constantly changing. Even in the time that we have prepared for this webinar, we've seen even additional activity there in the EU. I know of mention of something in Italy related to gating, right? Making sure that the spaces where kids are spending time are appropriate to them. Some of the language refers to age 15. I even saw the phrase, maybe those who are parents who maybe are using their children, refer to them as baby influencers. I don't know that that translated exactly correctly, but we are seeing this movement in multiple places. And I think to your point there, it's raising the alarm and something that we know is broken. Where it all settles out, I think you're right. That is what we need to give a little more time for. But there's clearly something. And so many countries are moving in that direction. And Jessica, that brings me over to you then, where here in the States, right, we have multiple levels where this sort of regulatory action can take place, right? There's this balance that exists between what can happen to the states, what can happen at the federal level. You spend a lot of time boots on the ground talking to average, parents who are struggling against some of these technologies. Could you just, again, we're sort of widening this understanding to make sure that we're all sort of in the same place, different angles, whether it was KOSA, whether it's what's happening internationally. Bring us now into what you see there in New York and some of the things that you've done to work sort of parent to parent with understanding and equipping them to move forward.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really key here, at least from a parent's perspective, was when the Surgeon General came out with the warning and said, kind of like the adult in the room, an official stance that this is not healthy, this is not good. And that is really when we started to see parents get involved on a much deeper level, because they've been told for so long that this stuff was really important to them being able to learn and exist in the world. And now here they're experiencing something different, and an adult is finally saying something different. And so Mama decided to partner with some New York State lawmakers and representatives to really put pressure on the state level of just, we had buses going up to the Capitol filled with parents saying, we can't do this by ourselves. We need help. You talk about the alarm bells and outcry. It's important, what we found, for the legislators and the people that we met with to hear specifically from the parents and how this was impacting them and their children, whether it's as simple as I can't get them off, or every time I set some parental controls, they reset, as soon as it's updated, all the way through to the other end of the spectrum with some of the more exploitative and, terrifying and horrifying things that no parent wants their child to be a part of. And we were very proud that that actually just passed, and it is quite historic, and I think a huge signifier, which, as we've spoken about in Europe and other countries, they're very far ahead. But here in America, to say, like, the parents have had enough, and if you're gridlocked for either lobbying or because of politicalization at a federal level, we can decentralize and go straight to our states and try and have them start to protect their constituents. And so that passed, and we're very proud that that happened. And now other states are following suit, and it's creating this sort of snowball that won't stop. Or at least
No, and that's really important, because there's a lot of policy that will roll its way toward Washington, D.C. that happens in New York and California, because these two states, where you are in New York, but also California, have so much influence on then what ends up happening in other parts of the country. And so some might go, well, that's one state, there are 49 others, but it's significant that it was what happened there in New York. And you said it passed. Could you just explain the it there one more time in a little more detail so everybody understands it? Thank you.
So Mama was a part of a coalition of groups that were going up to Albany, working with Senator Gounardis, the AG, the governor, to try and pass the Safe for Kids Act and the Child Data Protection Act. And those two, I believe, now have become one. But essentially, we wanted children to be able to, of a certain age, whoever they're following, the algorithm is not addictive. And it is also, if they want to follow Taylor Swift and their best friend and their mom, that is who they're getting in their feed. They're not getting suggested content that they didn't sign up for, either from advertisers or the algorithm itself. And then the other one is the data protection, that under a certain age, they should not be mining our children for as much data as they can to learn about them, to then in turn be able to target them with, first and foremost would be advertising, but other things, as this all develops, we're learning how data can be used against people, especially children who don't know of customized content and things.
Yeah, thank you for that. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think another important part of that legislation, which gets back to something, Gaia, that you said, right? It was the mental health harms that has really raised the alarm bells on this. I think that without parental consent during certain times of day when they're supposed to be sleeping, that they're not allowed to receive notifications, right? So we're preserving that sleep that is so precious during those adolescent years, whether it's kind of like from midnight to 6. Now, allowing parents to consent to that, but the default, which I think is key here, the default posture is no, unless you've been given a yes. And so I think that's another admirable piece of what has happened there. So thank you for that. Adam, with that, I want to move back to you because of your kind of corporate perspective on this, which is so important. And that plays into something that I enjoy talking about, and that is in society, at least one that is just and civil, there are multiple layers that work toward protecting our children, right? Primarily parents and caregivers as responsible in the forming of their children and protecting our children. But other layers in society, term that you use, Gaia, has a duty of care, right? And I often will talk about schools have a duty of care, places of worship have a duty of care, businesses have a duty of care, and then policy can come in when those are not doing their job when necessary. I'd like to press a little bit into what you have been a part of and what you've observed when it comes to what happens at the business level, because to me, some of what we're talking about is, well, this is what businesses should do. And yet that's not what all businesses are doing. And so tell us a little bit about what's happening there at Lego. You're really leading the way that others could copy and learn a lot from. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure, Chris. So I mean, just as a point, uh, businesses and industry in a lot of jurisdictions don't actually have a duty of care, if we're talking about the legal requirement. But that is now changing. So we are seeing, I mean, Guy was mentioning KOSA, but also in the UK Online Safety Act, and in Australian regulations, the actual legal formality of a duty of care is now being placed on businesses for online safety, which is I think a step in the right direction. But in terms of kind of corporate culture, and what is driving corporate behavior, the regulatory piece aside, they will be responding to basically the floor that's being set by major pieces of legislation. I mean, we've seen that uplift happen in much of the world with the GDPR. So now data privacy is treated much more seriously. Obviously, there are some shortcomings. So you can expect a similar effect, a slowly rising tide of kind of compliance as more regulation comes into place. Although the Brussels effect is not what it used to be, I would say as well. So this does, I think, really require the US to come in with significant regulation. Particularly because where the companies are headquartered. But I think what we are seeing in businesses is a recognition outside of legislation that they have not got this right, and the crisis is developing. I think they might not openly admit that, or if they do, we might not take that seriously. But I think you are seeing a few changes. I mean, Instagram has announced the teen accounts. YouTube is doing some well-being initiatives. It's for a lot of people not enough and too little, too late. But I think they're starting to get that message, particularly ahead of the regulation. In terms of what we've done and how we've responded to it, the Lego Group, we never really started down the path of building anything that isn't in the best interests of children. And from it's just kind of in our DNA, we're very conservative as a company, and what we've done with the digital space, which is an area which we've also walked into with a fair degree of trepidation, because at our heart, we're about the physical bricks, but we wanted to bring kind of that learning through play, and that kind of child-centric perspective through play into the digital world, and not have these mixed forums where you've got children, you've got a product that's like social media that is ostensibly created for adults, but you have children online there, and then that creates some complexities. We say, well, no, here is a safe space for children that we want to create that is there to unlock their creativity. We have Lego Play, for example, that is an app that has some social media elements. You can post pictures of your Lego creations, you can comment on your friends' feeds, you can do all these things. But before you can upload anything, it's pre-moderated. So that means human eyeballs are looking at that and saying that is appropriate to go up, that is not appropriate to go up. That slows down a lot of the back and forth. But these are kids, who are learning. They're kind of building their training wheels, on how they're understanding the internet. They don't need this quick free flow of information, and the rapidity of information that often leads to the harm. So that's just one guardrail that we would put in place. And also just having really age appropriate design, communicating the digital world in the language of 8 to 12s, 12s to 15s, making sure they've got prompts and nudges to re-engage with the real world, stop the addictive kind of features as well, moving past kind of infinite scrolls and going to paginated kind of elements. There's a lot of good you can do in design. Instead of dark patterns, kind of use light patterns to encourage positive behavior. So we kind of take that really seriously, and we're informed a lot by the work that we've done with UNICEF, which is it's called Responsible Innovation and Technology for Children, which is all about, well, online safety and privacy are really, really important. They're foundational. But if children are going to be engaging with the digital world, we've got to make sure they're engaging in the digital world in a way that amplifies their well-being. So not just keeps them safe and protected, but also, helps them develop and grow. And what does that mean? What features lead to that? So we've integrated that research into how we actually do design, so we can actually amplify their well-being when they're engaging on any services that we have.
I think what you're referring to, though, although it sounds common sense for the Lego group, actually isn't in a lot of other places. Instead of trying to retrofit children into digital spaces that weren't ever designed for them in the first place, which tends to be what we see. I think Instagram is a perfect example of that, where we're trying to retrofit children into a space with mixed humans and mixed content. What I'm hearing from you, and I don't know specifically, but what I'm hearing from you is, no, Chris, when we're designing products, there's a consideration for the best need for children in our roadmap. Like, that's a part of something needing to ship, has to check certain boxes. We're not going back and going, oh, we built this thing and let's try to put kids in it. And that is a radically different approach that I think more emphasis around a duty of care that has some teeth to it may force other businesses to look at it that way. Is that an accurate way of sort of the culture around
Yeah.
that at Lego?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't specifically call that out because it's just the way that things always have been done. So for us, it doesn't seem like a radical departure. It's just product development. But yes, the child-centric design from the onset, I think, is what is needed. And if you are developing a service that is likely to interface with children, that's the approach that should be taken. Their needs and their considerations should be integrated at the onset.
I literally just referred to that approach and sort of your perspective on this because I did a presentation for parents and it was about gaming. So with Roblox, Minecraft, and Fortnite, and how there's an island that's specifically created there with Lego that's age appropriate for children who might want to be in Fortnite to understand that, right? But it's been designed from the beginning with that age 10 or so in mind. And that's a very, obvious example of that. So thank you so much. Gaia, I want to go back to you for just a minute because I've used the word just a moment ago. This all seems so common sense. It's kids, right? We should be doing these things, and I think Jessica would say, well, yeah, as a mom, yes, we need to be doing these things. I'm sure there's other parents listening in too. So why isn't it happening? Like, why is that not true? Why can't we pass a few common sense bills and just ask businesses to do the right thing? Let's make it a part of the roadmap for design. Why isn't that happening? What are some of the hurdles that, a law professor like you, or even advocates like myself or Jessica, what are some of the things that are standing in the way? Gaia, could you unmute, please? Thank you.
Basically, it's not happening because the business model that many tech companies use is based on having us stay online for as long as possible so that we will see the ads. So it really dismantles the whole business model to accept these legal changes. And they're using two legal tools in the US, which do not exist, at least not to that extent in Europe, which is why we're seeing every law that passes is now being challenged on one or two grounds: First Amendment and Section 230. I'll start with the First Amendment because I think it's hard to understand if you do not live in the US how different it is here. I mean, basically, corporations got the right, freedom of speech rights in the 70s. They became stronger in 2010. And ever since then, they've been using them to fight regulation, not just the tech industry. It started with, junk food did it when they were told to put labels they did not like, saying that their food is harmful. They said, well, this affects our freedom of speech. And what we're seeing now is that law after law, the moment it passes, we're seeing a challenge It's a company, it's an organization called NetChoice, which represents big tech. And there are often successful. For example, in California, there was a law very similar to the UK Age Appropriate Design Code, which basically said, a part of it said that you have to have an impact assessment analysis to see if your product is harmful. This was validated under the First Amendment. And so it's important to see what they're actually saying. They're actually saying now that the addictive design features in their products, like the infinite scroll or the autoplay, this is their speech. And if they're prohibited from using this, their freedom of speech rights are affected. So that's, and you know, when I look at new bills like the UK Safety Online Bill, which focuses on harmful content, I'm jealous because I don't see how this could be adopted here with these kind of challenges. So the second thing is Section 230. Section 230 is a remnant of the old internet, the excitement about the internet. You know, everybody can post their information everywhere. Section 230 gives immunity to content hosts, like today it would be like Facebook or YouTube. So if somebody posts something, for example, that defames somebody else, they won't be liable. So, and this has been there for a long time. We know the internet has changed a lot since the beginning. But what is happening now is that tech companies are using this, saying that these designs are protected under Section 230. Basically, they're saying that even though these designs are their designs, they're not somebody else's, not a third party, they're saying that Section 230 immunizes them, and therefore there should be no regulation. So that's the huge hurdles we're seeing, and I suspect this will go all the way to the Supreme Court for this to be resolved.
Yeah, I've sometimes heard people refer to Section 230 as the 26 words that built the internet. In a time where we were chatting and using AOL for those outside, that was sort of the original way for us to get online and communicating in chat rooms. When Gaia said that Section 230 has been around for a really long time, we're talking about 1996. So I want us to think about the types of technologies that existed 28 years ago that those 26 words were intending to protect, right? It wasn't infinite scroll. It wasn't TikTok. It wasn't social media, even close to what we have today. I mean, goodness, MySpace was still 8 years from being released when we think about sort of the evolution of social media. So I think that's really important to understand that if we are going to be the country that is leading this conversation, to your point, that maybe the Brussels effect atom doesn't have the influence it used to, we are stuck in 1990s legislation that no longer adequately protects our children. You mentioned net choice as one of the obstacles, right? The lobbying force that is up against this. I want to read, this is a New York Times article that came out earlier this fall talking about the role of the lobbying machine that presses up against and, in their words, has distorted the original purpose of the First Amendment. This is a quote. It says, net choice is eviscerating what it means to be human and what is speech. And this gives these, the wealthiest companies in the world, an enormous advantage, said Tim Wu, a professor at Columbia University and a former White House official. He said the First Amendment was intended to protect the underdog, not these companies. And I think that again, I mean, that's a pretty direct statement there, coming from someone that works at the university level. When you hear a statement like that, is that sort of the emotion that we should have around it? Is that really what we're up against, or is that just hyperbole?
I think this is definitely what we're up against. I mean, I described what's happening in the court system, but that's also happening in every time a law is proposed, whether on the state level or KOSA. Tons of tech money and tech lobbyists are doing everything they can to stop this. It's basically a war against this regulation. It's a war against protecting kids online.
Yeah, with one objective, I called it out in a post recently. It's just kill the bill, whatever it takes, kill the bill. And
speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Often that's what we're up against. And Jessica, I know you've experienced this, right? Even at the state level, this isn't just a federal KOSA, issue. This is at all different levels that we're seeing this. As a parent, and myself, I have 4 children of my own, kind of in that middle school, teenage years. So I'm right there with you. And I know there are others on the call. I'm guessing there have been a few moments of what I'd call mom rage or parent rage when you hear these issues and you just want to get some things done and to do some things. And you've thought to yourself, it really shouldn't be this difficult. In prepping for this call, right, you've seen some of the challenges that parents have felt through this sort of arc of change because you have a child who's a little bit older and a child who's much younger. Um, how does this impact all that we're talking about here at this government high level? How is this impacting you, other parents, sort of in the day to day? What frustrates you most about what you've observed?
I mean, I think when we know better, we do better. I mean, that's kind of something I've been taught since I was a little kid. And when my son, who's now 13, I started this when he was 2 because I became unwell from overuse of the internet. I was an early adopter and overuser. Today, the kids call it brain rot on TikTok, but I guess it's been termed digital dementia. And I couldn't imagine what it would be like for my son who was 2, who'd never known any different. And this kind of sent me down this trajectory. And so I worked really hard to protect him, to protect his privacy, to favor in real life, simple things like books instead of screens, playing outside with his friends. He's 13. We'll see how it goes. We're entering those years where it's, proving a little bit more difficult. You talk about Fortnite. A lot of it's about belonging. So instead of giving him Fortnite, I would go and buy him books and I would teach him the Fortnite dances so he could talk to his friends about it. So I'm exhausted because it's really hard to do these things when the rest of the world is going in one direction. So I was super hopeful when the Surgeon General's warning came out. I was really hopeful, this thing I've been warning about forever, everyone else is starting to see it and experience it. And so therefore it should be easier, right? Like my 3-year-old a decade later, it should be easier to protect him because now we know. When in fact, it's the complete opposite. Tech companies have embedded themselves in the very foundation of these childhoods. Something as simple as dropping him off at the daycare, I have to scan a QR code that has all of his information on it. So you're normalizing that he can't be left with other adults to this child without being checked in, with a phone. And the portals needed for everything from school to grades. The 13-year-olds, actual education, they're submitting these ed tech campaigns in the school that are saying that they're compliant, but they're compliant with something that was created before we even knew what artificial intelligence and sextortion was. And so I am rageful because I'm exhausted. I am rageful because we know, because every adult in the room has now said this is a problem. I am rageful because these children are killing themselves, because they are harming themselves, because they are being extorted and exploited by corporations and other bad actors. And yet nothing is being done. Yes, there is a lot being done, but it's not being done on the level where it should be so easy. And again, it's back to what Gaia was saying of like, there's these 2 things. But what's great about Mama and Mothers Against Media Addiction is we can channel that rage and we can be the bee in the bonnet to let these people in power know that we're not going to give up the fight. We're just not, even if you put our faces and information on the internet, because these things are really happening. It's going to be more.
It is. It really is. And there's nothing like a bus full of motivated mamas to get something done. So thank you for what you're doing and for channeling that energy in the right direction. I think you're hitting on something that is often weaponized when it comes to these conversations. I call it the fallacy of the lazy parent, right? This idea that it should just be the parent's responsibility. And if parents were just doing more, then we wouldn't be having these issues. And I go back to, I think I referred to this earlier. I posted about playing Atari as a child, right? There was no child who was exploited playing the Atari 2600. I maybe had Atari thumb from too much Missile Command or Pac-Man or Space Invaders, but I was never exploited. And at that time, if your child was harmed playing Atari, then it was probably out of some negligence that you should be called out for as a parent. Okay. That's totally different today, but that is still used, I think, against us as parents to make us feel guilty that we're not doing enough. It's more on us. We've just saw that with Roblox, where this report came out with all of these documented harms. And what was their response? Their response wasn't to remove the things that were identified, the pedophile activity and all these kinds of things. It was to put more on the parents to create a new set of parental controls that parents now have to monitor to do a better job of keeping their kids out of the 900,000 instances of Diddy or Jeffrey Epstein Island or whatever it is, right? Like that's the typical response. And so I think your rage is justified. Are there parents who could do more? Absolutely. But I think this is why we need higher levels involved to rein in the abuse and the negligence. I'll go out and say it, the negligence that is clearly taking place. So, but I want to, we've talked a lot about kind of the landscape here, some of the specifics. Adam, I want to go back to something you said. You mentioned UNICEF, and I don't think everybody, some would, but not everybody is going to be familiar with them as an organization. But I've heard you talk a little bit about some of what you're doing at that level, some of the efforts you're making. If you could explain that. I mean, is it possible for those that are watching to engage in some of what you're doing at that level in any way? If not, that's okay. But I just would love to hear a little bit more about some of that positive hope that you referred to.
Sure. Yes, we all need a bit of hope. I think what UNICEF has been doing, they're as the UN agency for the protection of children and children's rights. They look at the digital world through a child's rights perspective. That includes kind of a right to be in a safe environment, a right to have their privacy protected, but also their right to kind of be empowered, right? And their right to participate in constructive activities and their right to play. So that's the kind of frame that UNICEF has taken to examining, well, what should the online world really look like? How do we protect children, but also empower them and safeguard their rights? As enshrined in kind of the UN Convention for Child Rights and General Comment number 25 and a few other instruments. So with that in kind of mind, they worked with the Lego Foundation and the Lego Group to come up with this research project called RightTech that I mentioned, which kind of builds a framework for what online well-being could look like. And if companies and businesses design their products in line with this framework, then they're amplifying child creativity. They're building meaningful social connections, not just social connections for the sake of it. They're creating competence. They're helping children emotionally regulate. They're obviously the safeguarding security is there, and that is key as well. But there's all these different elements, which is really targeted to thriving online rather than just surviving online. So they've developed this project. It's research that's been done kind of across the world in a diverse set of countries with hundreds of children and children and a bunch of academic institutions. And next week, actually, next Tuesday, they'll be releasing what they call the toolkit, which is basically design guidance for firms that they can take and then build features in that will hopefully enable them to actually kind of positively design for well-being. So as you kind of mentioned before, get that child-centric focus from the get-go. And we're doing what we can at the Lego Group to really spread the word about this and encourage other firms and companies that are building services for kids to adopt this well-being by design approach. Stop bolting things on at the end, start the child-centric design from the onset. And yeah, we're hopeful it's getting a lot of traction. I mean, the idea of well-being, holistic well-being, is being picked up. It's being reflected in some policy instruments and regulation around the world. The OECD is looking at this as well. So we'll hope to get a movement around here because the alternative, and we're kind of seeing some jurisdictions do this already, is removing kids from the digital world entirely. And I don't think that's the right approach. We don't think that's the right approach. The right approach is building appropriate products, age-appropriate products that help them grow, help them learn what it is to navigate the digital world. And then when they are of age, they can move into the Wild West, which a lot of the rest of us deal with, but they shouldn't be dealing with that Wild West right now. So it's understandable when they're faced with that, the instinct is let's remove them entirely because it's a horrible a place sometimes. But what we want to do is get it right, make it designed for children through things like RightTech, and encourage firms to have that wellbeing by design approach.
I think what you're touching on there is really important. And I know the word ban is clickable. Like when it comes to a news headline, right? We're going to ban certain technologies, that's clickable. But I think that's a different spirit than what you're talking about. And I've been talking with people about this tension between ban and can. There's a can in this that kids can do good things online, but let's make sure it's in a spot that was designed for them in the first place, right? Sometimes this comes up in the phone-free schools movement, and I am fully for it, right? Let's not only remove the phones from schools, let's give them back the gift of each other, which is what they crave, to create spots where they can interact with each other and get to know what it means to interact with other humans again. So it's not just a nothing approach, it's give them the things that are age appropriate and good for them. And I think that's what you're saying, which is so critical. So Gaia, here in the States, we've just come out, boy, you talk about this isn't just a kid thing. I think there's some adults that we need to get ourselves out of some of the toxicity and of social media here, having come out of an election season, and we're not quite out of it yet. And it might be easy to say, well, let's just wait until the next presidency comes into office, but that's not the way things work here. There is a period of time between now and Christmas in the US that is really important from a regulatory, from a legislative perspective. Could you educate on that? I think a number of individuals aren't really familiar with what that looks like, but this may be one of the more critical windows that we have if we're going to get some of this stuff over the line. Do you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So I mentioned KOSA before, which passed the Senate vote, and now is before the House. Now, the last thing that happened was it was reported out of the House committee, but it's not the same bill that came from the Senate. It is a very diluted bill. Tech lobbyists managed to influence it. So instead of having a duty of care to make sure the kids don't suffer from mental harms, you have a duty of care to prevent physical harms. Instead of having compulsive use defined as repetitive behavior related to the psychological distress, now it's defined as anything that could cause somebody an impairment in a major area of life, like walking or talking, again, physical. So suddenly we have this version of KOSA, which is not about the kid who stays up all night on social media, but still is depressed, but still somehow manages to go to school. So what is going to happen now, this is going to be discussed in the House. And people may think that nothing is happening until the new administration comes in, but that's not the case. We have what's called the lame duck session, and the same representatives who are there are still there, and they're going to decide the fate of KOSA. And working together with the Senate could bring us a stronger version of KOSA, but it's a really crucial time for people, if they want to become involved, to write their House representatives to make sure this goes through. Because if it doesn't go through now and we get to the next Congress, we're starting all over again, and we've never been so close. I mean, it's passed the House. It's a good law. It's focused on design. It provides broad protections. It provides parent controls, and we're the closest we've ever been. So I think this is probably the most important time, and it's not a time to think that things are quiet.
Absolutely. And it's not even off the table. Like, it's important for people to even look at those who maybe didn't get reelected this last time around there in the House on November 5th. Those are also individuals that maybe want to go out with a win, who maybe are retiring or whatever it might look like, right? So it's important for each of us, right, in the states that we're in, to approach our representatives during this period of time and to make sure they know about KOSA, what's at stake, that we've got something 91-3 out of the Senate. Let's get this done. And this is the moment. And so I think that's the key takeaway there, is this is no time to pause. It may feel that way because we feel like we've done the hard thing. We've come through the election, but now so many things can happen here at the last minute, like even up till 11:30 p.m. of the last day of the 118th Congress. There could be things that get tacked on if we've done enough to push it over the line. So we all, and this is, I think, something that even just parents and caregivers can attach to. You can go and find out who your representatives are, and you can write, and they have staff who read all of those, right? You can do these things. And I think that's really critical that we have that power in a representative government. So Jessica, with that, I want to kind of give you the last word here on some hopes and some positive movement forward. You're obviously passionate about activating everyone, moms and dads, to feel empowered to do something at the local level, even at schools. Like, what can that look like, just to give us a few more things that we might be able to try over the next weeks and months?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that we are the parents and we have the greatest influence over our children and their well-being. And during the pandemic and with the rise of use of screens, a lot of things were sent to the digital spaces. And I've noticed a lot of changes when the parents just start to show up again in person. You know, it's something as simple as emailing your teacher or your kid's soccer coach asking, how is tech being utilized? How are they being protected? What is the trade-off, right? The opportunity cost of utilizing this versus an in real life experience. And just letting parents know that they can question these things. You know, we've had a little bit of an era where we've just, you know, it was the fire hose of innovation and everything was going to be wonderful, and it's not, and the shame shouldn't be at their feet, and they were told this, and now the experience is something different, and we get a say and we get a voice. And if you're uncomfortable with reaching out to your representatives, then start right in your own home, and send an email to your teacher tomorrow, meet with their homeroom person, go to the superintendent, and also start talking to fellow parents, because the more that we get involved in this movement, that sort of collective action is what rises up. And so one of the things that, at our chapter meetings, parents will say, well, how do I get the kids off the phones, for play dates? And I say, well, you tell them they can't have phones on play dates. And so it's just this idea that we are the adults in the room. We don't have to leave it this way for the kids, and finding like-minded people to band together and say, we're not going to give our daughter Snapchat at 15, and this other family is also not. And I will say, as the resident dark cloud, that 10 years ago, it was very few people having these conversations. And now you have things like human change and policy and teams everywhere throughout the globe joining this conversation. So I am actually really hopeful that this isn't a passing trend. It's just more and more and more and more people joining and raising their voices.
Absolutely. And even to empower us more, I would really invite everybody to go find Unwired. That's the book that Gaia published last year. You can find that on her website. You can find it in all the different places that you might find books, but it does a really good job, I think, of demystifying sort of the business model, the intersection with policy, which can seem overwhelming, but then some real tangible things that we can do. You also mentioned a word, Jessica, there, collective action, which has been popularized now more recently with The Anxious Generation from Dr. Jonathan Haidt, which again, people should read to give more sort of tools in your belt to have these conversations. So you're right. The wave is starting to move in our direction, and hopefully we'll be able to get a few things over the line. We've had a couple of questions drop into the Q&A. One I went ahead and just answered, but I'll just say it here out loud. The question was, do you have a letter template to utilize in urging our representatives to pass KOSA? What I dropped in there was Fair Play, who is a strong advocate in this space. They have a page where you can type in where you're from, and it'll fill in who your representative is and automatically send you. So if you were to go to a Google search and type in Fair Play space KOSA form, it'll come up there in the top search results, and you can click on that, and it'll do much of the work for you just by indicating on the form where you're from. Again, a real easy way, and thank you, Fair Play, for doing that for us. A couple other questions too that are the same here. What about legislation to regulate AI to protect kids? And do any of the bills discuss cover new AI technologies? Those are two sort of in the same breath there. Adam, I'll point to you for a minute, and then Gaia, because I think, are you aware of anything on the international side that is trying to address some of the harms of AI?
Oh yeah, well, so the flagship regulation is the EU AI Act, and that takes a risk-based approach to AI regulation, which basically says there are some AI use cases which present high risk, and therefore either they're banned or if they do present a level of risk, there's mitigations, particularly around transparency and a few other things that must be put into place. There is some discussion about AI integrating into toys and whether that creates a high risk category. So that is an element of legislation. But I just want to kind of say we don't know enough right now about the impact of AI on children. And what we're really at risk of is kind of sleepwalking into the same situation that we're confronting now with social media. AI is being integrated into child-facing services. It's being, embedded everywhere. And we kind of didn't really realize when that was happening with social media and a few other things, and look at the harm that we're dealing with now. The same might be the same with AI. So we really need to take this lack of understanding seriously. And I'm very happy to announce that Lego Group is actually partnering with the Alan Turing Institute in the UK on research to understand the impact of generative AI on child well-being. So we're hoping to really launch some of those findings soon and build a coalition around getting to the bottom of like how do we design AI to amplify child well-being and not make the same mistakes that we have in the past.
That's right. We're prone to those mistakes, to running toward the next best advance without thinking of kids first. Here in the States, and Gaia, I'll give you the last word to expand on it. I know we got close in California in one way. We're trying to regulate at the state level related to AI. We were successful on one side where Governor Newsom signed into law related to the generation of deep fakes in AI, which is a whole nother sort of deep, dark spot. But it's a struggle, right? And so do you want to elaborate just a little bit from the US perspective on AI and what has and hasn't happened? And then we'll wrap things up.
Well, the US is definitely behind. I mean, but thinking specifically about kids, many of the laws, the online safety laws deal with algorithms which are powered by AI. So all the fact that kids are addicted and being brought to places that will keep them online for longer when they see horrible things like eating disorder information. All of this is powered by AI algorithms. So that's definitely one place we're seeing it. The second place was recently there was a lawsuit against an AI that friended a boy and led him to suicide. So I think this lawsuit got a lot of publicity, and I think this is the beginning of people focusing on what AI can do to kids. And I'm pretty sure that after this lawsuit, we're going to see some state laws in this space.
Yeah, you're referring to the young man, Sewell, I think was his name, with character.ai, and that's something parents really need to be aware of that. Well, gosh, it's a conversation I knew that we'd have a lot to talk about. And thank you so much to Gaia, Adam, and Jessica for your expertise and for really just the tip of the iceberg here. But I hope some really tangible, practical things that everybody at every level feels that they are able to do. And I'll have you know that the human change movement, this is not the end of anything. There's a lot going on. You'll see more happening as we head back to Davos in 2025 and continue these conversations related to AI, related to regulation, relating to creating these safer digital spaces for our kids, because they're worth it. It matters. And so thank you so much for everybody being a part of this conversation today. Please reach out to Human Change through their website if you have any further questions. And I hope everyone takes care. Goodbye.